Hello, everybody. Welcome to the May BIPS webinar. I can see some people are joining, and I'll just sort of start the introductions and start welcoming everyone in while more people join, so that hopefully by the time Lardan is ready to start with the webinar, we'll have a full audience. So welcome to the webinar for this month, and we're going to be joined very shortly by Lardan Nushin, who's going to be talking to us about Polish musicians in Tehran during the Second World War, peering through the cracks. And so we're very much looking forward to that. I'm going to run through a couple of slides, as I say, while people join and while just before Lardan gets started. I just wanted to tell you a couple of things, just so that you're all aware of some news that BIPS has to share. One is to tell you about our June webinar, which will be happening on the 30th of June, again at 5 p.m. on Zoom. And we'll be joined by Rudy Mati. He'll be talking about mehmandari, hosting and minding foreign visitors in Safavid and Qajar, Iran. And also just to remind you, coming up in just a few days, in 4 days, the deadline for applying for travel, research and research assistant grants. So head over to the BIPS website if you need to find out more information about applying for that. And of course, if you want to make sure that you never miss out on any BIPS news, these are just all of our tags if you want to follow us on social media, and the address of the website there. And just to remind you, the events policy, just to make sure that we're all really respectful of one another when it gets to the point at the end of Lardan's talk where we're asking questions, and that's just a reminder of those policies. And then we're just on to invite Lardan from St George's City University in London, and she's going to be speaking to us, and I'll just bring up her slides.
Hi, everyone. So first, I'd like to thank BIPS for this invitation and the opportunity to share my current research. I'm really delighted to be here. And I'd like to acknowledge also the Leverhulme Trust, who've made this work possible through a major research fellowship. It goes without saying that this is a very difficult time to be talking about Iran, particularly Tehran, a city that's very close to my heart. Some of you may previously have heard me talk about the sounds of Tehran in 1908, when the then new Parliament building was bombed by anti-constitutional forces supported by Britain and Russia. And I've also written about the sounds of Tehran during the Iran-Iraq War, and particularly the periods when Tehran was bombed. So there are clearly deep historical resonances with current events and what I like to think of as palimpsests of sonic memory. But for today, I'll be talking about my current project on the musical and cultural lives of Polish exile refugees in Tehran during World War II. So this work lies at the intersection of urban sound studies, music studies, and sensory studies. And as well as the focus on musical and cultural activities, I'm also interested in the wider sonics of displacement, the sounds of the refugees' journeys, their sonic experiences in their new temporary home, and the sounds that they brought to the already rich and complex soundscapes of Tehran. I explore the sonic entanglements between Tehran's various residents at this time, so war journalists, military personnel, and aid workers, as well as the refugees and local people, and the longer-term legacy of the Polish sonic presence in Tehran. So the aim is to better understand this little-known episode of Polish and Iranian history, one that has been largely forgotten, partly due to post-war politics and Soviet influence in Poland at that time. Centrally, I ask what a focus on auditory histories and sensory histories more generally might bring to our understanding of this period of Iranian history. So I'll introduce the project and then I'll focus on the artist and singer, Irena Valdi-Gołębiowska, and I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then I think we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So from at least the mid-19th century, Iran has been a place of refuge, from those fleeing Tsarist Russia through to refugees from Afghanistan following the Soviet invasion of December 1979, and later from Taliban rule. One of the lesser known stories is of the Polish exile refugees I'll be talking about today. So first, some historical background. Following the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Soviet Union annexed the eastern part of the country and deported an estimated 1 million Poles, as well as ethnic Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians, including those regarded as socially dangerous or class enemies, such as landowners, intellectuals, teachers, and factory owners. Deportees were taken to labor camps in Siberia and other remote parts of the Soviet Union, where they lived in extremely harsh conditions. After the Soviets joined the Allies in June 1941, the camps were opened up and many former prisoners travelled thousands of miles to, could we have the next slide, Eva-Leila, thank you. We've got a map. So they travelled to Krasnovodsk, which is now Turkmenbashi in present-day Turkmenistan, and from there on crammed container ships across the Caspian Sea to the port of Bandar Anzali or Bandar Pahlavi in Iran, arriving in two main phases between March and August 1942. I've also got another map on the next slide, which is from the National Archives. If we could have the next slide, please, which also shows some of the alternative migration routes. So the route I described wasn't the only route, but it was the main one. And the following slide is a photograph of Poles arriving in Anzali. Thousands died of starvation, cold, and disease along the way or on arrival in Anzali, where there is a large Polish cemetery. So, as many of you will know, Iran had been occupied by the Allies in August 1941, ostensibly because of Reza Shah's pro-German sympathies, but in reality to protect oil supplies and strategic routes between the Persian Gulf and the Soviet Union, as well as the borders of British India. So when the Soviet camps were opened up, Iran was the closest territory under Allied control able to take in refugees. Many men and women joined the so-called Anders Army, a Polish unit operating under British command. Civilians were taken to Tehran, and from there, many of them, with the help of aid agencies, went on to other cities such as Esfahan and Ahvaz, and some onto camps in India and Africa. Numbers have been estimated at between 200,000 and 300,000, including around 13,000 children who were orphaned or separated from their families. Most were Catholic, with around 2,000 Jewish Poles in Tehran by the spring of 1943. And I probably ought to say at this point that the numbers are somewhat contested, but the ones I've given you are based on the work of historian Leo Sternfeld, to whom I'm much indebted for his research on this subject. And actually the next slide is just an image of one of the camps outside of Tehran. The post-war settlement meant that few Poles returned home. Most ended up in countries such as New Zealand, Australia, the US, the UK, and Mexico, and many Jews went to British Mandate Palestine. A small number of Poles remained in Iran after the war. Some married locally, and their descendants are still there. By 1979, there was still a small Polish community in Tehran. So the aim of this project is to better understand this history through a sonic perspective. What role did sound play in people's lives, both in the journey from the camps and in Iran itself? What were the entanglements between Polish and Iranian sonic worlds? The refugees would certainly have experienced new sounds in Iran, such as the call to prayer or the many street vendors described by older Iranians that I've talked to. And then there were the sounds that the Poles brought with them, both the ordinary sounds of everyday life, including language, and musical and other cultural and religious activities. Studying history has sometimes been described as peering through the cracks, and this is certainly the case for the Poles in Iran, partly due to post-war politics, as well as barriers to accessing archives. My main sources to date have been archival documents, published memoirs, and some private collections that I've had access to, and I really hope to find more of the latter. I've mainly used the archives of the Sikorski Institute, the Imperial War Museum. If we could have the next slide, there's a photograph from the IWM, and the National Archives at Kew, as well as online collections of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC, that have good collections, and the Kresy Siberia Online Museum, including valuable oral history collections. There are still many sources to explore in both Polish and Persian, and I'd just like to acknowledge the wonderful work of my research assistants, Julia Pitko and Pantea Armanfar, who've been helping with this. In terms of extant writings, there are quite a number of published memoirs, I've already mentioned, in various languages, newspaper and magazine articles, and several documentary films. There is some academic research. If we could have the next slide, I've listed some of these, including books in Polish, a journal article and book chapter by Leo Sternfeld, concerned primarily with political matters, but with some references to cultural activities, and a brief section in Firuze Koshanizadeh's book on US-Iran relations. There's little specifically on music other than an article by Beth Holmgren on the musicians of the Anders Army, some online articles by Juliette Bretan, also mainly on the Anders Army Band, and a recent article by Sara Yar-Mahdavi and Habibullah Saeedinia on the social and cultural activities of Polish women, including music. Memoirs and oral histories regularly refer to sound and music. So I'm just going to give a few examples. So if we could have the next slide. In an interview recorded in 2006 by the UK Association of Jewish Refugees, Ludwig Finkelstein, who was deported from Lvov, now in the Ukraine, with his mother, Amalia, recalls her singing to him in the camps, including patriotic anthems and cabaret songs. He also recounts how, arriving at Bandar Anzali in 1942, quote, "We waded through the water to the beach, dragging whatever possessions we had behind us. And as we arrived, we sang the hymn, 'Lord who saved Poland in ages past.'" Norman Davis's book on the Anders Army quotes from one Wiesław Stepua about the competing sounds of Russian and British soldiers singing on the beach at Anzali. Sound here becomes a means of asserting power and symbolically claiming space. A testimony on the Kresy Siberia Online Museum, this is the next slide, is from Maria Kołodzińska, who recalls learning a song from a nurse whilst in hospital in Tehran. So she would have been very young at the time, and yet still remembers it many decades later, showing how deeply embedded such sounds can be in the memory. And I'd just like to play a short extract from this example, if we could have that over, Leila. Thank you. Hopefully it'll work. It was working earlier. We seem to have lost the sound.
Przez zagony i pole idzie sobie pachole, wielki wicher ulewa, ono idzie i śpiewa. Raz w nocy niedzielnej przy dzwonnicy kościelnej mróz wszelakie czucia ściął i Pan Jezus duszę wziął. Stary dziad mnie pochował, on mnie ubrał w sukienkę, znak zielonej Dąbrowy. That's it. I still remember. I don't think I'll ever forget it.
Thank you. Despite the fragmented historical record, we know that a Polish cultural presence was established within a relatively short time, with schools, cultural associations, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and libraries. For those who remained in Tehran, many took on jobs within the emerging Polish community and beyond, as nurses, translators, teachers, secretaries, hairdressers, maids, waitresses, and tailors. Specifically in relation to music, contemporary writings offer tantalizing glimpses. So the next slide is a quotation from Sternfeld. Iranian newspapers reported on concerts and parties arranged by the Polish community and advertised invitations to the public. On April the 30th, 1942, the Iranian newspaper Etelat announced the opening of a show with Polish artists in Tehran's theatre. A Polish jazz orchestra opened another night of entertainment in cafe restaurant Shamshad. Quote, "A dance party will follow the concert until 2 a.m., all for the price of 15 rials per ticket." Polish orchestras are also mentioned in a New York Times article by John Greeley. This is the next slide. Walking around the city, a visitor could easily find a hotel or garden offering traditional Iranian cuisine, excellent wine, and very high-priced European cocktails, all to the accompaniment of a Polish orchestra. The hotel at Darband and the Ferdowsi in Tehran proper are gathering places for the growing number of foreigners this war has brought: soldiers, aviators, refugees, newspaper men, diplomats, and others. Sternfeld also points to the wider impact on Iranian society, suggesting that even in such a short space of time, there was good integration into Iran's social fabric. So next slide, please. Polish exiles in Iran established newspapers, art galleries, cafés, orchestras, theatres, and salons that catered first and foremost to the Polish community, but later became central to the myriad of Allied army soldiers stationed in Iran, as well as to the emerging Iranian urban middle class. So one of the best-known Polish venues was the Polonia Cafe and Restaurant, located in a basement on Lalezar Avenue in central Tehran. There were already a few European-style cafes in Tehran by the 1930s, but the Polonia no doubt offered what felt like a more authentic European ambience for the troops and refugees who shared the wartime city. There were also the sounds of religious spaces. Local Christians and Jews, including Iran's well-established Jewish community, and Iraqi Jews who'd arrived shortly before the Poles, established relief communities to help their co-religionists. According to Sternfeld, Jewish refugees were given accommodations in synagogues and clubs or with Iranian Jewish families. Khosrow Sinai's beautiful documentary film from 1983, which is, I've listed it on the next slide, A Lost Requiem, and I highly recommend this film if anyone's interested in this topic, includes footage of a Polish church service in Tehran in the late 1970s. And just to say on an aside that it was actually through watching this film in 2015 that I first became aware of the story of the Poles in Iran, and was struck by the fact that in the context of the so-called refugee crisis in the Mediterranean at that time, that here were Europeans given refuge in the Middle East, an inverse of the stories we tend to hear about, and not so long ago in the span of history. So who were the Polish musicians in Tehran at this time? We have information, for instance, on a dance band called the Jolly Boys. Next slide, please. Thanks to material held at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum that was donated by a nephew of one of the band members. So the Jolly Boys were invited to Iran in the summer of 1939 to play at the wedding of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and so were in Iran when Germany invaded Poland. They stayed in Tehran for the remainder of the war, becoming resident band at the Palace Hotel. We have very few recordings of Polish musicians in Iran at this time, but the Holocaust Memorial Museum holds 2 records made by the Jolly Boys in 1947. If we could have the next slide. So these recordings were made shortly before leaving Palestine. Sorry, the next one, that's the Hotel Palace where they were resident. Yeah. So I thought it would be nice just to hear a short extract from the Jolly Boys band. This is a song called Kiedy, which means when, and just to give you an idea of the sound of this dance band at the time. Hopefully the sound will work. Okay, thank you. Just give you an idea of the sound. We also have some information on the Anders Army Band, next slide, that included leading musicians of the day, such as the composer Henryk Wasch and the associated theatre troupe, the Polish Parade. So the Sikorski Institute in London holds some materials mainly on performances in Baghdad, Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem, but there are photographs and film footage of the band in Tehran, thanks to the Polish Army Film Unit. And if we could have the next slide, a recent project at the Documentation Center for Deportations, Expulsions and Resettlement in Krakow, led by Mariusz Solars. This project has recovered and arranged some of the songs from the Anders Army Songbook. Historian Beth Holmgren, who I mentioned earlier, has explored, among other things, the ethno-nationalist discourses promoted in the army through which Jewish members were marginalized, and Jewish composers such as Varsh and Alfred Longin-Schutz were criticized for composing music that was not, quote unquote, Polish enough. But my interest is more on civilian musical and cultural experiences. So one prominent figure, next slide, was the pianist Adam Kapuscinski, who remained in Iran after the war and became professor at the Tehran Conservatory, as well as piano teacher to the royal household. The next slide shows one of a series of papers relating to two concerts held in December 1942, at which Kapuscinski performed with two other pianists, Adam Rudolsky and Portnoy. Another musician is singer and actor Anna Borkowska, who features in Khosrow Sinai's film, where we see her and hear her playing piano and singing in her home. Anna describes taking part in theatre productions held both to entertain and to raise funds for the refugees during the war. She also talks about the painful experience of losing her brother Victor, aged 27, in the labour camps, not long before they were opened up. So Victor was a musician and had studied violin at the Warsaw Conservatory. So I'll move on now for the second half of my talk to focus on the case of one particular singer, semi-professional singer and artist, Irena Valdi-Gołębiowska, who was in Iran between 1942 and 45. In October 2024, I was privileged to be introduced to Wacław Hubert Zawadzki, Polish historian and grandnephew of Irena, who generously shared with me a photograph album cum scrapbook of photographs, postcards, newspaper cuttings, concert programs and reviews, and correspondence from Irena's time in Iran, as well as documents such as her passport and ID card. If we could have the next slide. And I'd ask you please not to take photos or screenshots of these images, as they're from Hubert's private collection, and I'm showing them with special permission. And I just to express my gratitude to Hubert for sharing this material with me. When Hubert and I met and he showed me Irena's ID, I felt a strange thrill seeing her looking out from a distance of more than 80 years, a woman about whom I knew very little other than that she had suffered a great deal in the early years of the war and later spent time in a city to which I feel strongly connected and where my parents were born and grew up. I imagined her waiting slightly anxiously in some government office in Tehran for her papers to be authorized. The handwritten words in French, Persian, and Polish were so visceral that I wanted to know more about the official who'd written them and who almost certainly had talked to Irena. I found it quite an emotional experience holding the card with its mix of languages bearing testimony to a historical moment when events had brought Irena to a country far from her home. I tried to imagine what life would have been like for a member of the Polish landed gentry turned semi-professional singer in Tehran. What were the circles in which Irena moved, and who were her audiences? Born in 1891 near Warsaw in what is now Belarus, at that time part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Irena was a talented painter and singer, but coming from a wealthy family, only sang occasionally in public, including once, I was told, according to the family, in a performance of Carmen at the Warsaw Opera. She studied at the Warsaw School of Fine Arts and often travelled to visit art galleries elsewhere in Europe. Irena was living in Lithuania when it was annexed by the Soviet Union in June 1940 and was subsequently arrested in August 1941 and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp in the Urals for refusing to accept Soviet citizenship or to work as an artist for the regime. Together with her sister Maria, she spent about 6 months in the camp where living conditions were harsh and the main job was cutting down trees. When the camps were opened up, Irena and Maria travelled with the Anders army to Iran, where they stayed for the rest of the war. In Tehran, Irena was able to draw on her talents as a singer and gradually established a reputation, working under the stage name of Valdi. This enabled her to make a small living, supplementing her army stipend as her husband was an officer. Irena and Maria were well educated and spoke French, German, and Russian, as well as Polish. Maria, who was also musical, took a job as secretary at the Polonia Club, which I've already mentioned, and also occasionally played piano, including accompanying Irena in some of her recitals. And the next slide is a picture of Irena and Maria in Tehran. After her recent experiences, Irena found some peace in Tehran. Hubert reports that her memoir, if we could have the next slide, quote, records her feelings of happiness at having found peace and rest in the beautiful Iranian capital after the horrors of earlier experiences, and how she could never have imagined that she would find herself in Persia with its sunny and blue sky, and how she was enjoying beautiful Persian roses known to her only from fairy tales. Tehran in the 1940s was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan, with a more open cultural sphere following the departure of Reza Shah and the arrival of Allied troops, journalists, aid workers, and so on. And this impacted particularly on the entertainment district around Lalezar Avenue, with its cinemas, theatres, and international hotels and cafés. As such, Irena arrived in a city that was experiencing a relatively new and vibrant nightlife. Her collection of newspaper cuttings suggests that she mainly performed in somewhat exclusive settings rather than solely within the Polish community. Newspaper announcements and reviews include print media in English, French, for instance, Le Journal de Tehran, and Polish. There's an invitation and programme, this is the next slide, for a concert held on the 6th of March, 1945, at the Syro-Libanese Club, in which she was accompanied by Maria, who also played some solo pieces. A review published in the Gazeta Polska of Jerusalem on the 28th of March reports that the concert was well attended by, quote, an excellent high-quality audience. Other performers were Zorik Estilanian on violin, likely an Iranian Armenian, judging by the name. I've not been able to find any information on him. And a pianist, J.S. Summers Cox, who, according to the review, was a secretary at the British Embassy. And I've also seen documents that show that he was involved in the Anglo-Iranian Dramatic Society in Tehran at the time. As you can see, the repertoire was all classical music and included Polish composers Chopin, Wieniawski, and Moniuszko, as well as Bizet, Tosti, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Sarasate, and Prokofiev. Another concert was held at the Anglo-Persian Institute, this is the next slide, on Ferdowsi Avenue on Wednesday, the 13th of June, 1945. A newspaper notice offers insights into other activities at the Institute. So there's a talk on Milton's England and a film on England Shakespeare. We also learn that the Imperial Bank of Iran, which was controlled by Britain at this time, was to be closed on the birthday of King George. As well as the programme, Irena's papers include a letter, next slide, in French, dated the 29th of June from one David Hicks at the Anglo-Persian Institute, thanking her for the recital and expressing hope that they might hear her perform again soon. It's not clear how often Irena sang in these relatively privileged settings. An undated newspaper clipping in French, so this is the next slide, announces that, quote, for the first time in Tehran, the famous Polish singer Irena Valdi would perform every evening in the gardens of the café restaurant Shemiran between the hours of 9 and 10 p.m. Whilst this venue was less exclusive than the aforementioned clubs, the audience would still have primarily been from the international community in Tehran, as well as more affluent and well-connected Iranians, and less likely to have included many Poles. We don't know how long Irena performed at the café restaurant Shemiran. It was probably for the summer months only. Irena also sang in spaces where the audience would likely have been primarily Polish. So one newspaper clipping is an invitation from the Committee of Ladies attached to the Society of Polonia for an artistic evening with the participation of Mrs. Valdi-Gołębiowska and Mr. Adam Kapuczynski at the Polonia Club on Friday the 7th, we don't have the month or year, at 1800 hours to raise funds for the society. Entry for members is listed as 2 rials and 4 rials for guests. Tea was also to be served. According to another undated clipping in French, this is on the next slide, Irena sang for Radio Tehran, which would have given her a much wider audience, including amongst local Iranians. According to her family, Irena even claimed to have sung for the Shah, which is possible given her connection with Adam Kapuczynski, who had a presence at court. Irena's photograph collection includes a picture of the Shah's palace at Saadat Abad in North Tehran. What emerges strongly from these scattered fragments is that Irena was a colourful character who was able to take advantage of arriving in Tehran as an unknown entity and with a slightly exotic Polish cachet, and in a possibly more cosmopolitan environment than back home, to reinvent herself as a minor celebrity within international Tehran circles, and it seems she had many admirers. In her work on musicians and social liminality, next slide, please, Catherine Schofield argues that, quote, musicians in many societies seem to possess social liminality, unusual cultural sanction to cross ordinarily strict boundaries that are of significance to a particular society. Schofield's work focuses on professional musicians of lower status, which was not the case here, in that Irena's marginality was due to being an exile refugee rather than because of her class. Still, through her music, Irena was arguably able to transcend this liminal status and to enter certain elite spaces that would otherwise likely have been closed to her. It's probable that had her life in Poland continued uninterrupted by the war, she wouldn't have pursued a singing career. But having experienced the trauma of imprisonment and loss, including of family status, music became a means by which to regain some of her former social standing and even to create a new persona, allowing her also to act in some ways as a cultural ambassador in her temporary home. As well as music, Irena continued with her art. So next slide. Her memoirs record that she painted during her time in Iran, as well as acquainting herself with the work of Iranian artists. She also learnt how to make dolls in national Polish costume. A Polish doll factory had opened in Tehran, and she may well have taken lessons there. Irena left Iran for Lebanon in 1945. She stayed in Beirut for 3 years before coming to the UK, where she lived in various Polish resettlement camps, eventually moving to Leeds. Judging by her collection of newspaper cuttings, Irena maintained an interest in Iran, so there's even one reporting on the 1953 coup. Irena never returned to Poland, even to visit. In the UK, Irena continued with her art and held exhibitions at which she also sold work, for instance, at the Leeds Polish Club, the Manchester Polish Ex-Servicemen's Club, and in Huddersfield. Irena also performed occasionally. For instance, one newspaper cutting reports on a concert held at Cannon Hall near Barnsley in Yorkshire in 1949. Every summer, Irena travelled to North Wales to Penrhos, a village where many Polish people lived and where others would go for their summer holidays, and where there's still a Polish nursing home. According to Hubert, Irena loved Penrhos, where she would sing, play bridge, and paint. And it was there, at Penrhos, that Irena died of a heart attack in 1979. Maria stayed on in Tehran after Irena left and later returned to Poland. Hubert relates that, based on Maria's letters to his mother, for many years she regretted leaving Iran, where she had been happy, loved the climate and people, and had a good job. She was deeply nostalgic for the lost world she knew before 1979, but eventually found an administrative post at the Warsaw Conservatoire, which she enjoyed. Maria died in Warsaw a few months after Irena. So I've shared with you some of what the existing documents tell us about Irena and Maria's lives in Tehran, but there's much that we don't know, including, for instance, where they lived. So Irena used the Polish Red Cross in Tehran for her correspondence, the extent to which they interacted with other Poles, including musicians, and how they managed to build local networks within a relatively short time and gain access to elite spaces, as I've discussed. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find any recordings of Irena, and I'm trying to find out whether the Radio Tehran broadcasts still exist, although that's quite doubtful. So what do these fragments, and the many I haven't had time to talk about, tell us about the sounds of Polish Tehran? Notwithstanding the gaps, the items in Irena's scrapbook album place her physically within the various spaces of Tehran that she spent time in. The photographs, program notes, invitations, and thank you letters allow us to understand something of the geography of Irena's presence in her adopted city, and to some extent her relationship with it. So using these documents, I've been trying to map this presence as well as that of other Polish musicians in order to get a sense of the sound spaces of Polish sociality in Tehran at this time, with a focus on the area around Lalezar Avenue. So if we could have the next slide, please. So Lalezar, which since the 1920s, as I've mentioned, had developed as Tehran's main entertainment district, and by the 1940s was the hub of its nightlife. So there's a map showing the location of Lalezar Avenue, and the photo in the slide is actually from Irena's collection, and you can see the mountains in the distance. You could see in those days, no longer. So in terms of mapping, if we could have the next slide, here's what I've got so far with the help of my PhD student, Pantea Armanfar. And really it's just a start. It's hard to read the street names, but Lalezar is the one with the Polonia Cafe on. And there's a link on the slide to the interactive version of the map online. Most of the documents place Irena in two main parts of Tehran. If we could have the next slide. First, Darband in the far north of the city, so number 11, close to the start of the mountain trails and the location of the Darband Hotel and Café Restaurant Shemiran. And second, the area around Lalezar Avenue in central Tehran. And just to say that whilst Lalezar lost much of its splendor after the 1979 revolution, when many of the venues were closed down, memories of its former glory are still strong in the national imaginary and often invoked nostalgically in many ways. But for instance, in historical TV drama series such as Shahrazad from 2015 and another series, Khatun from 2021, so Khatun is actually set during World War II, and the series includes a reconstruction of Polonia and includes a storyline related to the Poles in Tehran. So we know that, if we could have the next slide, we'll go back to Lalezar. We know that Irena and Maria spent time in this area. Maria worked at the Polonia and Irena performed there at least once, maybe more. On nearby Ferdowsi Avenue is the Anglo-Persian Institute, where Irena sang in June 1945 and possibly on other occasions. Other popular spaces of sociality nearby include the legendary Café Naderi and the Grand Hotel. We can't be sure, but it's not unlikely that the sisters would have visited or been taken as guests to Café Naderi, or perhaps went dancing at the Grand Hotel. The newspaper sources quoted earlier mentioned Polish orchestras in venues such as the Café Restaurant Shemshad and the Ferdowsi Hotel, both also on the map. Although working in rather different musical worlds, I like to imagine, inspired by Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation, that the paths of musicians such as Irena, Maria, and the Jolly Boys might have crossed in these streets. The Polonia was, after all, just a short walk from the palace hotels where the Jolly Boys were resident. Khosrow Sinai's documentary film, A Lost Requiem, which I mentioned earlier, if we could have the next slide, please, includes footage purportedly from the Polonia during World War II. Whilst making the film in the 1970s, Sinai visited the basement space where Polonia had been, and the space by then was a chocolate factory, and it actually later became a print shop. And I'm just going to play a 1-minute extract from the film just to give you an idea. There's a very interesting history of the film, which I don't have time to go into, but the sound quality is quite poor, I'm afraid, but it will give you an idea. Yes, if we could have that. Thank you.
I found a small chocolate factory which was once the Polonia bar and restaurant. Polonia means Poland, and many Polish women had no choice but to come to places like this to keep the company of the soldiers of the Allied forces who came to Iran during the war.
Thank you. Actually, just go to the next slide. You just go to the next slide, then that's great. Thank you. At the southern end of the map is Dar al-Funun, a college of advanced education founded in 1851 and where the December 1942 concerts with Adam Kapuscinski and other pianists that I mentioned earlier took place. These concerts were intended for students at the Honaristan, the high school conservatory, as well as Iranian musicians and music lovers in general. The concerts were free and by invitation via specially printed cards. It seems that the repertoire was mainly by Chopin, about whom one of the musicians also gave a pre-concert talk. So to conclude briefly, this project is very much in process. We're currently working through oral history recordings and memoirs, as well as documents in the Sikorski archive on the Polish schools in Iran, and a magazine produced by the pupils called M, which means us. And this includes information on musical activities. The next slide is a photo from one of the Polish schools in Esfahan, which was kindly shared with me. Thank you. Another interesting publication we're looking at is Polak v Irani, which means Poles in Iran, almost 100 issues of which were published in Tehran between 1942 and 44. And the next slide is an example of the kind of thing we're coming across. And I'll just pause so you can read the translation. So when I read this, I just became really intrigued by these listening groups. Unfortunately, we haven't yet found more information on these groups, but I'm hoping that we might do so. In terms of the anticipated project outcomes, as well as a book and some articles, the plan is for public-facing activities and to make this story better known, including an exhibition, a radio program and a concert featuring a specially commissioned piece by Yulia and Pantea, who, as well as being research assistants on the project, are both sound artists in their own right. So the piece will be created by two young composers, one Iranian and one Polish, reflecting on this shared history. I'm hoping that the archives and personal collections will yield further information that will allow us to build a richer picture of the sounds of Polish Tehran and the sonic and wider sensory lives of the exile refugees, their entanglement with others in the wartime city, and the long-term impact on Iranian music and culture. And if we could have the final slide, that's just a thank you. Thank you for listening. And then I'm done.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Really enjoyed, I loved listening to the clips and seeing the video there as well. So it's now time, if anyone in the audience has any questions that you would like to ask Ladan about anything that she's been talking about with us this evening, then please do enter that in the chat that's sort of down in the bottom part of the Zoom box. So do enter your questions while people have a think about what they would like to ask. Oh, we're actually already getting. I was going to ask a question, but I will. It's actually the Q&A, isn't it? Not chat. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions already. One of them is actually quite long, so I just need to maximize my screen so I can see it better. So someone is asking a couple of questions. I'm just going to read them out to you, Ladan, because it's quite a bit long a question. Do we know if the activities of these musicians were contained between themselves, musically speaking, or were there any interactions with Iranian counterparts, such as music classes or collaborations? Was there any link to the Dar al-Funun school? Or is there any space to argue that these Polish musicians were another parallel medium for Iranians to encounter European music?
Can I answer that one? Because there's
I thought we'd take one at a time.
Separate. Yeah. Thank you, Bardia, for your question, and hello. Yes, I think it definitely. I hope I've given a sense that the picture that we get is that this music was not just within the Polish community. So one of the pictures I showed you in fact, the picture on the poster for the event, which is from the Holocaust Memorial Museum, it shows the Jolly Boys, but with Iranian musicians as well. We don't know who those were, haven't been able to find out who those musicians are, but they definitely did collaborate with Iranian musicians. I feel like I'm only just starting to scratch the surface actually but they certainly with the Darul, so the concerts of the Darul Funun. So Adam Kapuczynski, we have some information about him, not very much. We know that he taught at he stayed on after the war, he taught at the Tehran Conservatory. So the likelihood is that he did collaborate with other musicians. And I'm aware that there's other people in the audience, like Jane Lewison, for example, who might also have answers to these questions. So happy if that's possible for other people, as you might also have some comments on Lalezar. So I think the answer to the question is definitely it wasn't just contained. I think that there are different spaces and there was definitely collaboration. It's just that I guess partly also because of the post-war situation and the situation with archives and so on, it's quite hard to find some of that evidence. And if anyone has any suggestions or has come across any, I'd be very, very happy to hear. But thank you for that question.
Yeah, and then another question from the same person. Lalezar is such a curious place. It included a wide range of voices from Qamar al-Muluk and Arif Qazvini to Irena. Do you think this is just a matter of that this site is just famous and well known as a hub, or is there something cultural at work, something really consciously sort of trying to gather all these voices together in one location and perhaps away from others?
I mean, it's a really good question. I don't have, I'd have to think about it, I think. And yeah. I'd be really happy if Jane was able to come in at some point, because this is really her area of expertise. I think in terms of what was happening there, I mean, these musicians were playing in the hotels, the cafés, that there was such a concentration of those institutions in Lalezar at that time. And of course, bearing in mind how much smaller Tehran was at that time as well. But yes, thank you for the question. Jane, would you like to add anything? Is she able to?
She could write something.
Yeah.
Jane has written some links to Polish related material.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
But the broader audience can't see those links, so that's just to share with Ladan later. I'll go through more questions. We've obviously got some people really enjoying. Thank you for a wonderful lecture and finding it really interesting. Can you tell us any more about the Poles in Esfahan?
So my focus is on Tehran, but I'm looking at Esfahan a little bit because that's where there were several Polish schools in Esfahan. These were largely for children who were orphaned or been separated from their children, but from their parents. But there were also those whose parents were in the army, for example, or working, who were in those schools. And Khosrow Sinai's film has some amazing footage. Actually, goes back to one of the schools that's still standing. And I can't really say much more about it, except that we're exploring it. We found there's quite a lot of material actually in the Sikorski Institute that I don't know if Yulia's in the audience. I saw that Pantia is, that Yulia's been translating and we're working through. And they did. There are some articles already published actually about this magazine that was published by the students. We know we have some information on the musical activities, on the music teachers there, for example, but we're kind of just still working through that. So
sounds like there's much more to explore. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Do you get a sense of the importance of music for Poles in Iran, especially the children, for helping to deal and to heal, the trauma that they experienced during their deportation to gulags in the Soviet Union, and also just their exile, right, from whom I would add on myself.
So I mean, that's a really good question, and some of the material that we found relating to the schools in Esfahan include things like letters and poems that were written by children. There's lots of descriptions of sort of scout activities and communal activities, including singing. And there is some mention of music acting in this way, and I'm fairly sure that would have been an important thing. There's also an article by Eliana Adler, which is more about music and sound in the camps, not so much in Iran, but she does mention some religious. So there was a rabbi who was tasked with looking after some of the children in Tehran. I think it was probably for a short period of time, and he gave an oral history interview many years later and talked about how some of the religious singing it had a real impact on the children from an emotional point of view. So I think that was also probably related to something you're alluding to in the question.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do we know if this Polish musician phenomenon is more centered on Iran, or do we know whether there were other Polish artists, musicians in other parts of the Middle East?
Yeah, so the Anders Army band spent a short period of time, or the army and then the band, and the associated theatre troupe, the Polish Parade, they were in Iran, but then they traveled to other Middle Eastern countries. So I mentioned, that, and actually, if this would be a separate project for someone, the Sikorsky has quite a lot of material on their activities in Iraq, in Egypt, in Palestine. So definitely there were musicians associated with the army. I don't know so much about whether there would have been civilian musicians. I guess the case of Iran was that so many of the civilians who came through Iran then moved on to places like India and Africa, and some of the children, there was a big group of children who went to New Zealand, for example, rather than necessarily being moved to other parts of the Middle East. So less likely probably for civilians, but that doesn't mean that there weren't necessarily.
Yeah, great, thank you. Someone else has asked, do we know anything about Irena's engagement with Persian language and culture? Mm-hmm. Did she ever sing in the Persian language? And then they've got another question, but I'll let you ask that one first.
Yes, I don't know, and I don't think so. No. I think Hubert's in the audience. I don't know, actually, and that's a really interesting question. There's some very touching footage in Khosrow Sinai's film where Anna Borkowska, she sings in Polish, but at then one point she sings in Persian, but it's a Polish song that she's translated. So she's singing this Polish tune to Persian words, which is wonderful. So yeah, again, so I hope I can save the chat somehow, because there's some really great questions here.
Yeah, for sure. And they've also asked, what inspired you to conduct this research? Why this topic?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I did actually write something about it at the beginning, but I had to cut it because of time. So I've had a strong interest in urban sound for a number of years, and had been planning to do a project on the sounds of Tehran. And I got some funding from the Leverhulme Trust finally to do this, to have some time back in 2020, and then I couldn't travel to Tehran because of COVID. So the project ended up being very different. The plan had been to go to Tehran, to do on-location recordings, to talk to people about their sonic memories and their sonic experiences. And so as a result of that, the project became much more historical than I'd planned. And I became very interested in particular historical periods. So the book that I'm writing, one chapter focuses on Tehran during the 1980s, but I became very interested. I thought the 1940s was a particularly interesting time because of the occupation, because of various other social reasons. And it was really through that I'd seen Khosrow Sinai's film back in 2015, and then kind of filed it away in my mind and didn't really think about it. And then when I started in 2020, when I started working on the Sonic Tehran project, and started looking again at World War II, I was reminded of that story, and then I came back. It came back to my consciousness, as it were, and that's how I got interested in it. And what was very interesting was that many Polish friends or friends with Polish heritage, who I'd known for many years, turned out that they'd had family who'd gone through Iran, and I'd known these people for many years, and we'd never talked about it. And so it was, it was kind of a revelation, really. And the biggest challenge has been, I wish I'd discovered this topic 20 years ago, when many of the people who'd been in Iran were still alive. Or the problem is that my background is not I'm not a historian. I've never done archival work before, so it's all very new to me.
Yes.
I'm an ethnographer primarily, and my hope had been to be able to talk to people about their memories. But obviously many of those who were in Iran at that time have passed away or are very old, and so that's there are lots of recorded oral histories, but obviously they're not specifically about music, so I'm having to work through those to try and pull out.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yeah,
and thank you,
I wanted to ask you myself personally,
yeah,
what brought you to this project. So thank you to the audience member who asked that question. Well, we've got a comment. I'll share it because it's a nice comment. It's not really a question, but it's always nice to have compliments. So I'll share it. Just thanking you for such a beautiful and meaningful webinar, and that it's transported this person to a different time and place filled with reflection, emotion, and connection. The experience was both inspiring and grounding. And I think this is actually nice to read this out at this time. You know, this is from a time of war in the 40s, and we're living through a time of war again. So it is nice to have think of hope and things that bring people together. But yeah, so music is indeed the common language that brings us together beyond borders, backgrounds, and beliefs. And Ladan, your talk did indeed capture that beautifully. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxana.
So another thanks. Could you say a little bit more, please, about how these musicians were positioned in terms of the perception of the West as a center of civilization or modernity? Is there a sort of an elite vibe to these events? Were members of the Polish community and identifying themselves as Eastern or Eastern European, or in solidarity with non-Western communities? Yeah, so just sort of thinking about how were the Poles perceived, or how did they perceive themselves?
That's an interesting question. And again, there's probably people in the room who are more qualified to comment on this than me, but my sense is that they definitely saw themselves as European, and therefore, I guess, Western in relation to the east of Iran, the sort of exotic Persia, and if you like. From the Iranians' point of view, from what I've read and the films that I've seen, what's interesting is that although there was some hostility towards the occupation, particularly the Russians, but also, I mean, you know, they were British, there were also US troops in Iran for whom there had been no agreement actually for them to be there. So, you know, it was quite a complex situation. The Poles, I mean, I sometimes wonder how romanticized this story has become, but the many people that Khosrow Sinai interviewed for his film, for example, all talked about the incredible hospitality that they received, that they were made to feel welcome, that they were made to feel human again after many years of suffering. That doesn't directly address your question, but I think they would have been seen, you know, the sort of comments about, you know, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, you know, definitely seen as coming from the West, I think, specifically answering your question. Yeah,
thank you. And do we know anything about their connection with the Armenian community? Because of course the Armenian community was the biggest community of Christians in Iran. So did the Poles connect at all?
My understanding from Leo Sternfeld's work is that there was a lot of support from local Christian communities who I imagine would have mainly been Armenian, but not necessarily completely 100%. So I'm trying to find Sten's question again. Was it just?
It was, yeah, it was just, what was their connection? What was their connect? Did they have a connection with Armenians?
Yeah. Khosrow Sinai's film has a very beautiful passage which is in one of the churches in Tehran, which I think is one of the Armenian churches, but there was a Polish mass there once a week, so they definitely would have, there were connections.
Okay,
but
great.
Yeah.
Someone else asks, is there any mention of Irena or other Polish musicians in the writings of Iranian musicians or music scholars of the time, active at that time, like Vaziri or Khaleqi or anyone?
Unless anyone else out there has found anything, I haven't, and that's why I was so surprised to find this story because, I'd spent decades researching Iranian music and had never come across a reference to Polish. I mean, maybe that was I was remiss there, but it's almost John, not as far as I know, but again, maybe other people, I mean, it's surprising in a way that there wouldn't be. We're still, there's still a big job to do looking back at old newspapers and, local newspapers and so on. But in terms of writings on music, I haven't come across any.
Okay, well, this is what's wonderful about a webinar like this, that it can
Totally.
connect
Yeah.
people from I have people here in all different parts of the globe, and people can now reach out to you, and you can make connections and build those networks, and hopefully get more information that will support your work.
There's a
Then,
comment about the
yes.
Polish community in Istanbul. That's interesting.
Yes, so there's some comments, yes, thinking about work on the Polish community in Istanbul, so that there are sort of those connections. There aren't really any more questions that we've missed. There's a bit of people like wanting to give you some information, Lardan, but of course we'll make sure that you can keep all of these comments.
Please save the chat. There's a question about connections with Polish musicologists.
Yes.
Yeah, I've reached out to some. I will be visiting Poland in September. I'm more than happy to meet up with anyone working in this area. So the answer to the question is yes, I have reached out to a few where I've been able to make the context, but also Polish Iranologists as well at the University of Warsaw. So yeah.
Yeah,
but very, very happy to hear from anyone.
Anyone with any connections or information that will be of use to Lardan, I'm sure will be wonderful. That's all oh no, we've got another question, sorry. In your opinion, did Iran succeed at that time in creating a sense of home for the Poles through music? You've sort of touched on that the welcome that you see reported.
Yeah, and I think from everything I've heard, the Poles were made to feel welcome. And I think, certainly Maria and Irena felt very at home there. And, Maria, as you've heard, kind of regretted initially going back to Poland because she was happy in Iran. How much that was through music, I don't know, but I imagine that, so spaces like Polonia, for example, and obviously there's sort of religious spaces, but other community spaces, music was an important part of that, I think. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. There's so many people just writing thanks and the sort of deep-hearted sort of meaning, the emotions that it's given people to hear you talking about these times and these things people have connections with. So thank you. Yes, I'll leave the final words to you.
Well, no, I just wanted to thank everyone, first of all, for coming and listening, and also for all your amazing suggestions, which, as I say, hopefully we'll be able to save the chat. And just thank you. And my email address was on the last slide, but I'm not difficult to find. Happy for anyone to message me separately on any of this. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Lardan.
Thanks for the invitation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. Good luck with the rest of the project. And thank you to everyone who came and joined us to listen, and have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you very much.